There comes a moment in your life when the noise of the world fades, when the expectations of others lose their grip, and you are left alone with yourself, not your mask, not your image, but your raw, unfiltered truth. And in that moment, you are faced with a question. Are you proud of who you are becoming? Not what you show the world, but what you see in the mirror when no one is watching. Because pride, real pride, is not built on applause. It is built in silence. It is built in the mornings, when you wake up tired, but choose discipline over comfort. It is built in the nights when you fight your inner demons and refuse to surrender. You see, the greatest battle of your life is not with the world. It is within you, your fear, your doubt, your shadow. Yes, your shadow, the part of you that whispers, "You're not enough. You'll fail. Why even try?" But listen carefully, that voice is not your enemy. It is your test, because the person you are meant to become is hidden behind everything you avoid, behind your fears, behind your pain, behind your excuses, and the only way to reach that person is to walk through the fire, to face yourself completely, not just your strengths, but your darkness too, because you cannot become whole by denying half of who you are. True transformation begins the moment you stop running and start confronting, when you take responsibility not for what happened to you, but for who you choose to become. That is power. And slowly, you begin to change, not overnight, not magically, but through small, relentless actions, one choice at a time, one discipline at a time, one step closer to your true self, until one day you look back and you realize you didn't give up, you didn't break, you became stronger than your excuses, stronger than your past, stronger than the person you used to be. And in that moment, you don't need validation, you don't need approval, you don't need the world to tell you anything, because you already know. You made yourself proud, not because you were perfect, but because you refused to quit. Not because it was easy, but because you chose growth over comfort. Not because anyone was watching, but because you stayed true to yourself. So if you're struggling right now, if you feel lost, if you feel like giving up, remember this: you are not here to impress the world. You are here to evolve, to rise, to become. And one day, when everything is said and done, the only opinion that can matter is this: did you make yourself proud? Friends, seekers of truth and architects of the inner world, hear this. The journey of life is not measured by the applause of others, nor by the transient accolades that the world bestows. True accomplishment is not a gift from circumstance, but a discovery of the self. To make yourself proud is to answer the silent summons within you, to confront your own shadows, and to become the master of your own destiny. The self is not something external, something to be possessed. It is a process, a continual forging of character through confrontation with your own unconscious. Many flee from this challenge, seeking comfort in imitation, in the applause of the collective. Yet the voice that calls you to greatness speaks not in words of others, but in the quiet insistence of your own conscience. Each day, when you rise, you are given a canvas, blank and waiting. What you paint upon it is neither trivial nor accidental. Every choice, every action, every thought shapes the architecture of your inner world. To make yourself proud is to live with courage in the face of your fears, to embrace responsibility, and to act with integrity even when no eyes watch. Do not mistake external success as for inner fulfillment. A life lived only to please others is a shadow, an empty echo of what could have been. True pride emerges from the synthesis of your conscious intentions and the acceptance of your unconscious, from the reconciliation of desire and duty, instinct and reason. Know that suffering is not a punishment but a teacher. In your trials, in your failures, in the solitude of introspection, you encounter the raw materials of greatness. Each wound, each misstep, each moment of doubt is an opportunity to craft the self you will one day honor. The call to make yourself proud is a call to individuation. It is the journey from the fragmented ego to the harmonious self. It is not a path of ease but of depth. Only by facing the darkness within, integrating it, and transforming it into wisdom, do you ascend into a life that you can look upon with admiration and respect. And so I say to you, do not seek the praise of the world. Seek the quiet approval of your own soul. Let your actions, your choices, your courage, and your love be the measure by which you judge yourself. For when the final hour comes, it will not be others who stand with you, but the entirety of your inner self, and you must meet it with pride. Confronting your shadow is not merely an exercise in moral fortitude or ethical discipline. It is the most intimate, profound, and perilous journey that a human being can undertake. The shadow is the hidden domain of the psyche, the repository of impulses, fears, desires, and memories that the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. It is the part of ourselves that society teaches us to reject, the traits we deem unworthy, the instincts we fear, and the emotions we deny. It is not inherently evil, nor is it an external adversary to be vanquished. It is the unclaimed portion of yourself, the unlit corner of your being where the raw, unprocessed energy of life resides. To confront it is to step into the darkness of your own soul, to meet the unrecognized and unaccepted parts of yourself without flinching, and to bring them into the light of consciousness. Most people live their lives in denial of the shadow. They wear masks, construct personas, and follow scripts written by culture, family, or circumstance. They tell themselves that their anger is unacceptable, that their greed is shameful, that their fear is weakness. In doing so, they fragment themselves. They build walls between the conscious self and the unconscious, creating a divided existence in which true freedom and authenticity are impossible. The shadow is never eradicated by avoidance. It grows, festers, and eventually manifests in indirect, destructive ways through projection onto others, through compulsive behaviors, or through inner unrest and dissatisfaction. The shadow does not disappear, it simply waits for acknowledgement. To live without confronting it is to live a life that is half sleeping, a life of partial truth, a life that will never know the profound satisfaction of wholeness. The confrontation with the shadow begins with recognition. It begins with the honest, unflinching observation of your own behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. It requires that you look at the ways in which you deceive yourself, the ways in which you rationalize, deny, or suppress. The shadow often appears in projections. You see in others what you refuse to see in yourself. That irritation, that anger, that judgment toward another is often a mirror of an unacknowledged part of your own psyche. When you feel sudden dislike, envy, or fear, examine it not outwardly, but inwardly. Ask yourself, why does this disturb me? What does it reveal about my inner landscape? The shadow is communicated to consciousness through feelings, dreams, slips of the tongue, and recurring patterns in life. These are not random, they are signals, the psyche's language, guiding you toward integration. Integration does not mean indulging every impulse, nor does it mean surrendering to destructive tendencies. Rather, it is a disciplined engagement with the shadow, a dialogue rather than a conquest. It is the process of recognizing and understanding your darker aspects so that they may be transformed into sources of strength, creativity, and wisdom. For example, the energy of anger, when repressed, may manifest as passive aggression or resentment. When confronted and understood, it can become a force for asserting boundaries, catalyzing change, or inspiring action. The desire for power, if denied, may lead to envy or manipulation. If integrated, it may fuel leadership, ambition, or self-actualization. Every shadow impulse contains a dual potential. One path leads to chaos, the other to mastery. Confrontation is the turning point. The process of confronting the shadow is rarely light or comfortable. It requires courage because it involves staring at aspects of yourself that you have been conditioned to see as shameful or unacceptable. It requires patience, for the shadow is deep and multi-layered. Its roots are entwined with childhood experiences, cultural conditioning, and unconscious fears. It demands humility, for you will encounter traits in yourself that you loathe or fear. It requires honesty, for any rationalization or self-deception will prolong the journey and undermine your growth. The shadow is merciless in its truth. It reveals what you resist and magnifies what you deny. Yet it is only through this merciless mirror that you gain clarity, power, and freedom. Dreams are one of the most potent arenas for shadow confrontation. In the symbolic language of dreams, your unconscious speaks freely, revealing patterns, fears, and desires that the waking mind cannot tolerate. The figures that terrify, repel, or disturb you in dreams are often projections of your own shadow. The monster, the betrayer, the thief, the seductive figure all represent facets of your inner world that have been unacknowledged. By engaging with these dream images, by exploring their meaning and recognizing their connection to yourself, you begin to integrate the shadow into consciousness. This is a sacred dialogue. The conscious mind listens, interprets, and transforms, while the unconscious mind is honored and contained. The integration of these dream messages is a cornerstone of individuation, the process by which you become a fully realized human being. Shadow work extends beyond the private realm of thought and dream into action in the world. To confront the shadow is to notice when you react impulsively, when you judge harshly, when fear or desire drives you into patterns of avoidance or aggression. It is to pause, reflect, and choose a response that acknowledges the unconscious forces at play. It is to cultivate mindfulness, self-awareness, and ethical courage. For example, if you recognize envy rising when a colleague succeeds, you confront it not by suppressing it, nor by acting destructively, but by exploring what that envy signifies, what desire, what longing, what unmet need is hidden within it. And then, having recognized it, you can transform it into motivation, compassion, or self-improvement. The shadow becomes a teacher, not a tyrant. The active shadow is another dimension of this work. We are not isolated beings, we are part of families, communities, and societies. The unacknowledged shadow of the collective manifests in prejudice, violence, greed, and denial. By confronting your personal shadow, you gain insight into the dynamics of collective darkness. You recognize how unconscious biases, cultural conditioning, and inherited trauma shape your perceptions and behaviors. You become a conscious participant in the world, capable of acting ethically, compassionately, and with awareness. Confronting the shadow individually ripples outward, contributing to the healing of the collective psyche. Confronting your shadow is ultimately a sacred act of self-honor. It is the affirmation that every part of you matters, that your wholeness is worth pursuing, that your life is a canvas upon which you are both artist and observer. It is an assertion of autonomy, a rejection of self-deception, and an embrace of authenticity. In this confrontation, pride is born, not the pride of ego, but the quiet, resilient pride of a self that knows itself, owns itself, and engages with life fully. The shadow, once integrated, no longer gainots you as an external threat. It becomes a reservoir of strength, a source of insight, and a guide toward fulfillment. Yet, the confrontation never truly ends. The shadow is dynamic, ever-evolving, shaped by new experiences, challenges, and insights. Life continually presents opportunities for recognition, integration, and transformation. Each encounter with the shadow deepens self-knowledge and brings you closer to wholeness. The journey is cyclical, profound, and infinite, for the self is not a destination but a process. To confront the shadow is to commit to lifelong growth, to a courageous engagement with the totality of existence, and to the creation of a life that is meaningful, authentic, and profoundly your own. Responsibility is the cornerstone of the human psyche's evolution. To embrace responsibility is to recognize that your life, your actions, and your choices are not merely the byproducts of circumstance, environment, or fate, but expressions of your own conscious will. Responsibility is not a burden imposed by society, nor is it a set of external rules to obey. It is the internal acknowledgement that your existence carries weight, significance, and consequence. The act of claiming ownership over the entirety of your being, your thoughts, your emotions, your desires, and your behaviors, and allowing this ownership to guide the formation of the self. To embrace responsibility is to awaken from the slumber of unconsciousness, to step out of the collective currents that carry most humans along the river of life without awareness, and to assert your individuality with courage, clarity, and integrity. Most humans avoid responsibility. It is natural to seek the comfort of blame, the solace of excuses, and the illusions of innocence. To blame the world, others, or fate is to deny the power of your own agency. The shadow of irresponsibility manifests in procrastination, self-sabotage, avoidance, and projection. When you fail to embrace responsibility, the unconscious manifests through destructive behaviors, repeated patterns, and dissatisfaction. Life, however, does not reward evasion. It challenges those who resist their own duty with increasingly urgent lessons, often delivered through hardship, conflict, or loss. The refusal to accept responsibility is not merely a practical failure, it is a spiritual and psychological stagnation, a refusal to participate fully in the creation of your own life. Embracing responsibility begins with the conscious recognition of your role in your life. It is the moment of awakening when you acknowledge that your choices have consequences, that your thoughts shape your perceptions, and that your actions ripple outward, affecting others and the world around you. Responsibility is not limited to the grand gestures of moral courage or ethical heroism, it is expressed in every moment. It is the recognition that how you respond to difficulty, temptation, failure, or fear is an expression of your character. Every decision, no matter how small, carries the potential to strengthen or weaken the architecture of the self. Psychologically, responsibility is deeply intertwined with individuation, the process by which one becomes whole. The individuation process demands that you acknowledge all aspects of your psyche, both conscious and unconscious, and take ownership of them. To evade responsibility is to fragment the self. To embrace it is to integrate and unify. When you accept responsibility for your thoughts, emotions, and actions, you cease to be a passive participant in life and become an active creator of meaning. You recognize that the world is not merely something that happens to you but is a mirror in which your inner state is reflected. Your failures, conflicts, and triumphs are not arbitrary, they are invitations to growth, opportunities to align with the self, and catalysts for moral and psychological development. Responsibility extends beyond the individual into relationships and society. Each human action resonates beyond the self, creating consequences that may be immediate or subtle, local or global. To embrace responsibility is to recognize the ethical dimension of existence. It is to act with awareness that your behaviors influence others, and that the unconscious projections you carry into relationships can either harm or heal. By taking responsibility for your emotional state, your communication, and your choices, you can take control of your life and make positive changes. You contribute to the creation of a more conscious, compassionate, and aware collective reality. This awareness is a bridge between psychological development and ethical maturity. It connects the inner world with the outer world in a manner that is both practical and transcendent. Responsibility is not merely a cognitive recognition, it is a moral and spiritual posture. It is courage made manifest in daily life. It demands that you face your mistakes with honesty, accept your limitations without self-deception, and respond to challenges with integrity. Each failure becomes a teacher, each misstep is a step toward mastery, when viewed through the lens of responsibility. Avoidance, on the other hand, leads to a life dominated by resentment, fear, and projection. The individual who refuses to take responsibility lives perpetually at the mercy of circumstance, a life dictated by the whims of others or the accidents of fate. True freedom, paradoxically, emerges only when one accepts the weight of one's own choices. The embrace of responsibility also necessitates confronting the shadow. Many aspects of the shadow manifest in avoidance of duty or denial of consequences. Traits such as laziness, selfishness, fear, or aggression, when unrecognized, undermine the capacity for responsible action. By acknowledging these traits and taking ownership of them, one transforms potential liabilities into strengths. Anger, when consciously owned, becomes a tool for setting boundaries. Desire, when understood, becomes a motivator for construction. Heavy action. Fear, when faced, becomes a source of courage. The process of shadow integration is therefore inseparable from the embrace of responsibility. Each conscious acknowledgement of the self's darkness strengthens the ability to act ethically, wisely, and authentically in the world. Responsibility is intimately connected with meaning. Viktor Frankl, in his Reflections on Human Suffering, observed that meaning emerges through the acceptance of one's own existence, through taking ownership of life's circumstances, and through the conscious choices made in response to them. To embrace responsibility is to claim authorship of your own narrative. Life, with all its unpredictability, suffering, and beauty, becomes a canvas upon which the individual exercises freedom, guided by conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. The responsible person does not merely react to events, they engage with them, transform them, and imbue them with significance. Each act, each decision, each ethical engagement contributes to the architecture of a life that is coherent, authentic, and worthy of pride. Moreover, embracing responsibility is an ongoing, dynamic process. Life is ever-changing, and the challenges and circumstances one faces are never static. Responsibility is not a fixed point to be achieved, but a continuous practice, a daily exercise of awareness, courage, and integrity. Each morning presents new choices, new consequences, and new opportunities for self-expression. Each interaction, each decision, each reflection is an opportunity to deepen the commitment to responsible living. It is through this persistent engagement that the self matures, that character solidifies, and that true pride is cultivated. Responsibility, finally, is a pathway to liberation. The paradox is that by taking full ownership of your life, you gain freedom. Freedom is not the absence of obligation, nor is it the ability to act without consequence. Freedom is the alignment of will, consciousness, and action. It is the integration of the self into a coherent, empowered whole. The individual who embraces responsibility no longer lives under the tyranny of external circumstance or the unconscious pressures of the psyche. They have reclaimed authority over their inner and outer world. In this reclaiming, they experience a profound sense of self-respect, pride, and existential fulfillment. To embrace responsibility is to honor the deepest calling of human existence, to participate fully in the unfolding of your own life, to accept the consequences of your choices, to act ethically, and to cultivate mastery over your own being. It is a courageous confrontation with reality in all its beauty and terror. It is a commitment to authenticity, integrity, and wholeness. It is the declaration that your life matters, that your actions have weight, and that your existence carries the potential for greatness. In the end, responsibility is not external, it is internal, profound, and transformative. It shapes the contours of character, the structure of the psyche, and the course of the soul. To embrace it is to step into the fullness of life, to claim authorship of your own destiny, and to forge a life that will inspire not only others but yourself. There is no greater source of pride than the life lived fully, consciously, and responsibly, a life in which the individual stands in alignment with the self, empowered, aware, and whole. Choosing integrity over approval is the most profound act of courage a human being can undertake. It is a declaration to oneself and to the world that your inner truth is more valuable than the transient accolades, validation, and admiration of others. In the vast theater of human existence, most individuals live their lives as actors upon a stage constructed by the expectations, judgments, and desires of others. The applause, the recognition, the The fleeting approval of society, family, and peers becomes the metric by which they measure worth. Yet this path, however seductive, leads inevitably to fragmentation, alienation from the self, and the subtle but persistent erosion of authenticity. True integrity, in contrast, is the alignment of consciousness, action, and values. It is the harmonious integration of the self into a coherent, ethical, and courageous life. To choose integrity is to risk disapproval, to risk isolation, to risk discomfort, yet it is the only path that leads to the deepest and most enduring form of pride, self-respect. Approval is intoxicating. From childhood, humans are conditioned to seek it. We learn to smile when praised, to conform when rewarded, to suppress impulses when chastised. The ego grows accustomed to the comfort of recognition, the illusion of security that comes from external validation. However, approval is inherently ephemeral, conditional, and often misaligned with the truth of our inner being. To live in constant pursuit of approval is to allow your psyche to be governed not by your own inner compass, but by the fluctuating judgments of others. The individual becomes a shadow of their potential, a fragment of their own self, perpetually chasing illusions while sacrificing authenticity. The paradox is that the more you chase approval, the further you move from the very self that would grant you genuine satisfaction. Integrity, by contrast, is self-sovereignty. It is the conscious commitment to act in accordance with one's values, principles, and understanding of truth, irrespective of the applause or condemnation of the external world. Integrity requires honesty not only with others, but above all with oneself. It is the unflinching acknowledgement of one's thoughts, emotions, motives, and actions, without rationalization, denial, or evasion. This honesty demands profound courage because it often places the individual at odds with societal norms, expectations, and pressures. Yet it is precisely in this tension that growth occurs. The dissonance between external expectation and internal truth is a crucible refining character, deepening awareness, and forging the resilience necessary for true self-realization. Choosing integrity over approval necessitates confronting the ego. The ego, in its natural desire for safety, comfort, and recognition, often seeks validation from the external world. It fears rejection, ostracization, and conflict. In this fear, it compromises, conforms, and adapts at the expense of authenticity. Shadow elements including fear, insecurity, and self-doubt manifest most vividly in these moments of compromise. The ego whispers that approval equates to worth, that compliance ensures survival, that disapproval equates to failure. To act with integrity is to silence this whisper, to confront the shadow within, and to affirm that the value of the self is independent of external judgment. This is the path of individuation, the reclamation of the self from the dominance of the ego and the collective. The psychological cost of seeking approval is significant. When one acts to please others, one becomes increasingly alienated from one's own emotions, desires, and instincts. Authentic impulses are suppressed, creative energy is diverted into performative behaviors, and the psyche fragments into a false persona designed for acceptance. This persona, while socially effective, is hollow. It cannot sustain genuine fulfillment. Individuals living in this state often experience anxiety, depression, and a profound sense of emptiness, which Jung described as a symptom of disconnection from the self. In contrast, integrity cultivates coherence, alignment, and psychological resilience. It allows the conscious and unconscious mind to work in harmony, reducing inner conflict and creating a fertile ground for growth, creativity, and authentic self-expression. Integrity is not a solitary endeavor, it is relational. Choosing integrity shapes the quality of one's relationships, for interactions grounded in truth and authenticity foster trust, respect, and genuine connection. In contrast, interactions grounded in the pursuit of approval foster dependency, manipulation, and superficiality. When one acts with integrity, even at the risk of disapproval, the consequences are paradoxically liberating. The self becomes unshackled, the psyche becomes coherent, and relationships become more authentic. The courageous act of choosing truth over acceptance communicates a profound message to the unconscious mind, that you are worthy, whole, and capable of standing in your own light. The moral and ethical dimensions of integrity are intertwined with psychological well-being. Ethical action, grounded in self-awareness and inner truth, cultivates harmony between the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche. It reduces projection, diminishes internal conflict, and nurtures a sense of agency. Conversely, actions motivated by the pursuit of approval often externalize the shadow, projecting disowned impulses onto others and perpetuating cycles of misunderstanding, resentment, and conflict. The path of integrity transforms potential chaos into constructive energy. Every choice, every ethical decision, every act of courage reinforces the architecture of the self, building a foundation that cannot be shaken by external opinion or circumstance. Integrity also demands resilience in the face of criticism and rejection. To act in accordance with truth is to expose oneself to the possibility of disapproval. The world is rarely aligned with our inner values. The collective consciousness often rewards conformity over courage, compromise over authenticity. Yet it is precisely in these moments that the power of integrity reveals itself. Each act of alignment with the self, regardless of external reception, strengthens inner confidence, deepens self-respect, and fosters a sense of purpose that is impervious to the fickle nature of approval. Over time, this resilience becomes self-reinforcing. The more one honors one's truth, the less external judgment matters, and the more one embodies the totality of one's being. The spiritual dimension of choosing integrity over approval cannot be overstated. Integrity is an expression of the self, the archetypal center of consciousness that Jung described as the totality of the psyche. To live with integrity is to honor this center, to act as a conscious participant in the unfolding of one's life, and to align with the deep, often ineffable currents of meaning and purpose. It is a sacred act, a covenant with one's own soul, and a declaration of authenticity in a world that constantly tempts individuals towards superficiality, imitation, and compromise. The individual who chooses integrity lives in accordance with the deepest principles of life itself, creativity and love. Practical application of integrity requires ongoing vigilance. It requires continual reflection on one's motives, actions, and consequences. It necessitates discernment between ego-driven desires for approval and genuine expressions of the self. It demands mindfulness, emotional awareness, and ethical courage. Each decision, no matter how small, becomes an opportunity to practice integrity. Speaking honestly when it is difficult, acting ethically when it is inconvenient, admitting mistakes when it is humiliating, and refusing to compromise essential values for temporary gain. These acts accumulate, creating a life that is coherent, dignified, and deeply satisfying. In essence, choosing integrity over approval is a lifelong commitment. It is a journey of self-discovery, shadow integration, and ethical maturation. It is the conscious rejection of superficial validation and the embrace of profound self-respect. It is the act of reclaiming agency, asserting sovereignty over one's own life, and standing firmly in alignment with the deepest truths of the psyche. Those who live with integrity inspire not by words alone, but by the embodiment of authenticity, courage, and alignment with the self. They teach through example that true worth is found not in applause, but in coherence, honesty, and unwavering fidelity to one's inner life. Ultimately, integrity is the foundation of self-pride. Approval fades, recognition is transient, and external validation is unreliable. But integrity, once cultivated, endures as an unshakable pillar of the psyche. It is the measure by which the self evaluates itself, the standard against which the soul finds satisfaction, and the source from which genuine fulfillment flows. To choose integrity over approval is to choose the path of wholeness, the path of psychological maturity, and the path of a life truly lived. It is to stand courageously at the center of one's own being, to act with wisdom and authenticity, and to become the person one is destined to be. Courage is often conceived as the heroic act, the bold confrontation with life's most terrifying trials, the epic decisions that define legacies. Yet true courage is not solely expressed in grand gestures. It is most profoundly cultivated in the small moments, the seemingly inconsequential choices, the silent acts of integrity, compassion, and awareness that ripple through the psyche and the world. These moments, often overlooked by both the individual and society, are significant and deserve attention, are the building blocks of character, the crucibles in which the self is forged, and the gateways to authentic wholeness. To act courageously in the small moments is to affirm life, to assert agency over one's existence, and to cultivate the strength to face the profound challenges that inevitably arise. It is the subtle, persistent embodiment of virtue in the ordinary, a discipline of the psyche that echoes in the very structure of one's consciousness. Most individuals underestimate the power of the small moment. Life's grand stages, the climactic turning points, are often fetishized, while the ordinary is dismissed as trivial, mundane, or irrelevant. Yet the small moment is never truly small. Each choice, each hesitation overcome, each act of honesty or integrity is a node in the network of being, connecting the conscious and unconscious, the personal and collective, the temporal and eternal. The person who cultivates courage in these moments develops a resilience that transcends circumstance. The individual who confronts fear, discomfort, or temptation does not merely survive, they evolve, they grow, and they transform the very structure of the psyche. Courage, like a muscle, is strengthened through repetition and conscientious engagement. It is the accumulation of these small acts, consciously chosen, that creates a life capable of standing firmly in the face of existential uncertainty. The small moments are also the most psychologically significant, because they reveal the hidden operations of the unconscious. Every impulse to lie, evade, judge, or remain passive is a shadow momenta confrontation with disowned aspects of the psyche. By choosing courage in these ordinary junctures, one engages in shadow integration. The impulse to remain silent in the face of injustice, the desire to indulge laziness or resentment, the instinct to conform for comfort or approval, all are invitations to act courageously. To meet these impulses with awareness, to pause, to reflect, and to choose the path of authenticity, is to engage in the quiet, profound heroism of daily life. Each small, courageous act is a confrontation with fear and a reclamation of agency, gradually realigning the ego and the self into a coherent, integrated whole. Passion, philosophically, acting courageously in the small moments is the essence of moral discipline. Virtue is not achieved through isolated heroics, it is cultivated in the repetition of conscientious choice. The ethical life is constructed not in extraordinary episodes, but in the ordinary accumulation of right action, honesty, compassion, and responsibility. These moments, when repeated and integrated, shape character, orient the psyche toward truth, and solidify the moral architecture of the self. By refusing the shortcuts of fear, laziness, or self-deception, we can avoid the pitfalls of life. The individual asserts that their life is meaningful, that their values are sacred, and that their agency is not subject to circumstance. Courage in the small moments becomes a deliberate, conscious stance against the entropy of the mind and the pressures of the collective, a daily declaration of integrity and self-respect. The archetypal dimension of small courage cannot be overstated. Jung emphasized that the psyche operates through archetypal patterns, recurring motifs that shape human experience. The hero archetype, often imagined as a figure of epic valor, is equally expressed in the quotidian. In the refusal to gossip, in tea, and the willingness to apologize, in the decision to speak truth in a subtle social context, in the persistence of creative labor despite doubt. Each small courageous act is an archetypal enactment, a microcosmic battle between the conscious self and the unconscious forces that seek to undermine, distract, or dilute it. Through these actions, the individual engages directly with the heroic dimension of their own psyche, reinforcing the alignment between personal behavior and the archetypal structure of meaning. Psychologically, small courageous acts cultivate self-efficacy and resilience. The person who repeatedly chooses integrity, honesty, and authenticity in daily life internalizes the lesson that fear and discomfort are not absolute barriers, but indicators of growth. Each moment of courage reinforces the belief in one's ability to act according to principles rather than impulses, to honor the self rather than yielding to the ego or the collective. This internalized pattern becomes the substrate for larger acts of courage, creating a life in which moral and psychological fortitude are habitual rather than episodic. By confronting fear in microcosm, the individual prepares for confraternity. Temptation in macrocosm, the small moment is the seed of epic transformation. Courage in the small moments also has profound relational consequences. The subtle acts of honesty, accountability, and compassion shape the moral atmosphere of one's relationships. By choosing to act with integrity, even when unnoticed, the individual models behavior for others, creating ripples that extend beyond the immediate context. Families, workplaces, and communities are shaped not merely by grand gestures, but by the accumulation of these micro-actions, by the consistent demonstration of values through behavior. Each small courageous act contributes to the creation of trust, authenticity, and ethical cohesion. In this sense, the individual's private courage is inseparable from the collective moral fabric, emphasizing the interdependence of personal and societal development. The spiritual dimension of acting courageously in small moments is equally profound. Spiritual development is not solely the product of mystical insight or grand revelation, it is cultivated in the disciplined attention to daily life. Each courageous choice, each refusal to evade discomfort, each affirmation of the self against temptation is a sacred act. These acts cultivate alignment between the conscious mind and the deeper currents of the psyche, fostering harmony, presence, and connection to the transcendent. Courage in the small moments is therefore a spiritual discipline, a means by which the individual enacts sacred principles in the temporal world, transforming ordinary experience into a field of growth, insight, and meaning. Practical application of this principle involves mindfulness, reflection, and deliberate engagement. Each day presents innumerable small moments. Moments when honesty could be compromised for comfort, when empathy could be foregone for convenience, when responsibility could be shirked in favor of ease. By cultivating awareness of these moments, pausing to reflect on the options, and choosing the path of courage, we can choose a path that leads to courage, not just for ourselves, but for others. The individual gradually strengthens the habit of integrity and the resilience of character. Small courageous acts are often invisible, uncelebrated, and devoid of immediate reward, yet their cumulative effect is transformational. The individual becomes self-reliant, morally coherent, psychologically resilient, and spiritually attuned. In essence, Courage and G is neither accidental nor purely reactive. It is cultivated through conscious, deliberate action. The small moments are the arenas in which this cultivation occurs. They are the testing grounds of character, the laboratories of the psyche, and the crucibles of the soul. By acting courageously in these moments, the individual aligns the conscious mind with the unconscious, integrates the shadow, reinforces ethical and moral principles, and prepares the self for the inevitable crises that life will present. Each act is both a victory and a lesson, a seed planted in the fertile soil of the psyche that will grow into enduring strength, wisdom, and authenticity. Ultimately, the practice of acting courageously in the small moments is the pathway to wholeness. It is the embodiment of integrity, the enactment of shadow integration, the reinforcement of psychological resilience, and the cultivation of spiritual alignment. It teaches that greatness is not solely measured in extraordinary feats, but in the consistency of ethical and courageous action in the ordinary, quotidian flow of life. It transforms the individual from a passive participant in circumstance to an active creator of meaning, a hero in the ongoing narrative of their own existence. By choosing courage in the small moments, one cultivates a life that is coherent, authentic, and profoundly worthy of pride. Suffering is the crucible of consciousness, the inevitable companion of existence, and the mirror in which the human psyche confronts the depths of its own being. To accept suffering as a teacher is not to glorify pain or to seek it out unnecessarily, but to recognize it as an indispensable aspect of the human condition, a profound instrument through which the self communicates, matures, and evolves. In Jungian thought, suffering is not external alone, it is both an external circumstance and a reflection of the unconscious tensions within the individual. It is simultaneously a challenge imposed by life and a lesson arising from the unacknowledged or undeveloped aspects of the psyche. Those who refuse to confront suffering are destined to repeat its lessons in varied forms, encountering the same difficulties, shadows, and conflicts until they are understood and integrated. To accept suffering as a teacher is to transform adversity from a source of despair into a medium of insight, growth, and awakening. Most people instinctively resist suffering. The ego, conditioned by social, cultural, and familial imperatives, seeks comfort, pleasure, and security. It interprets suffering as an enemy, a violation of the personal narrative, or an injustice to be avoided or overcome. In response, humans construct elaborate defense mechanisms: denial, projection, rationalization, avoidance, and distraction. Yet this resistance, while understandable, perpetuates a state of unconsciousness. The psyche communicates through suffering its signals where there is imbalance, unintegrated shadow, moral conflict, or unresolved trauma. By avoiding suffering, the individual closes the door to this deep wisdom, remaining trapped in cycles of frustration, confusion, and repeated mistakes. True growth demands that one not merely endure suffering but confront it with presence, reflection, and openness. Suffering as a teacher operates on multiple levels. On a personal level, it illuminates the aspects of the self that are repressed, denied, or disowned. Emotional pain, relational conflict, or moral dilemmas often arise precisely in the spaces where the psyche is fragmented or where personal response is required. Reconcilability has been evaded. By examining the origin of suffering, the individual can trace it to unmet needs, unacknowledged desires, fears, or patterns of avoidance. The process of this examination is not a passive reflection but an active engagement, a questioning of motives, acknowledgement of truths, and recognition of patterns that have previously remained hidden. Suffering thus becomes a guide, revealing the contours of the self that have been neglected or suppressed. On a psychological level, suffering cultivates resilience and moral fortitude. The act of confronting pain with awareness, rather than denial, strengthens the capacity to face future adversity. It transforms fear into courage, despair into insight, and helplessness into agency. Each experience of suffering carries embedded within it the opportunity for skillful navigation, ethical discernment, and conscious action. The individual learns not only to endure but to respond creatively and constructively, integrating lessons into behavior, thought, and emotion. This integration fosters coherence between conscious awareness and unconscious impulses, reducing inner conflict and enhancing the ability to live authentically and meaningfully. Suffering also plays an essential role in the individuation process. Jung described individuation as the journey toward wholeness, the integration of conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche. Suffering serves as a catalyst for this process. Life's trials compel the individual to confront both personal and archetypal patterns, to wrestle with the ego, the shadow, and the collective unconscious. Pain, loss, betrayal, illness, and moral conflict all operate as forms of psychic pressure, pushing the individual toward self-examination and growth. To accept suffering is to engage actively in individuation, to participate consciously in the shaping of the self, and to recognize that every hardship carries the potential to deepen understanding, foster maturity, and illuminate the hidden dimensions of existence. The philosophical dimension of suffering is equally profound. In a world governed by impermanence, uncertainty, and the inevitability of loss, suffering is not an anomaly but a natural condition. To resist it is to resist reality itself, creating inner tension and existential despair. To accept suffering as a teacher is to align consciousness with the fundamental truths of life, that pain and joy are interwoven, that loss is inseparable from attachment, and that transformation requires the dissolution of old forms. The individual who embraces suffering does not merely survive, they awaken to the deeper logic of existence, recognizing that life's apparent cruelties are, paradoxically, invitations to wisdom, empathy, and self-realization. In this light, suffering is not punishment but pedagogy, a method through which the psyche educates the self. Suffering also has a relational and social dimension. Pain is often intertwined with interpersonal dynamics, reflecting unresolved tensions, unspoken truths, or ethical dilemmas. By accepting suffering as a teacher, one gains insight into the ways in which one's actions, omissions, and attitudes affect others, and conversely, how others' actions illuminate aspects of the self. Conflict, disappointment, and grief are therefore not only personal experiences but mirrors in which the psyche encounters its relational reality. By engaging with these experiences consciously, the individual learns empathy, discernment, and the skillful navigation of human complexity. Suffering becomes a medium through which moral and relational intelligence are cultivated. The spiritual dimension of suffering is equally significant. Across religious and mystical traditions, suffering has been regarded as a pathway to enlightenment, self-knowledge, and union with higher principles. Jungian psychology resonates with this perspective. Suffering opens the individual to transcendent experiences, archetypal insights, and the deeper currents of the collective unconscious. By embracing suffering, the individual recognizes that pain is not only a personal event but a universal motif, connecting them to the broader tapestry of human experience. This recognition fosters humility, gratitude, and the capacity to find meaning even in adversity. Suffering is a bridge between the finite self and the infinite patterns of existence. It is both a test and a teacher, demanding engagement with the highest dimensions of consciousness. Practical engagement with suffering involves mindful presence, reflection, and transformation. First, one must resist the instinct to escape or deny pain. This requires courage, patience, and honesty. By observing suffering directly, whether emotional, physical, or moral, the individual begins to uncover its origins and implications. Second, one must reflect upon the lessons embedded in suffering, questioning how it reveals hidden aspects of the self, unprocessed emotions, or unfulfilled values. Third, one must act upon this insight, integrating understanding into behavior, choices, and relationships. This may involve setting boundaries, acknowledging responsibilities, seeking reconciliation, or cultivating compassion. Through this triadic process, presence, reflection, and integration, suffering is transformed from a source of despair into a medium of growth, wisdom, and authentic strength. Accepting suffering as a teacher also entails the development of patience and long-term perspective. The lessons of suffering are rarely immediate, they unfold gradually, requiring attentive observation and repeated engagement. Life's pain often cycles, presenting similar challenges in varied forms until the underlying pattern is understood. The individual who resists the impulse to escape, who cultivates patience, and who continually seeks insight, gradually learns the rhythms and logic of these lessons. Over time, suffering ceases to be arbitrary or meaningless, it becomes intelligible, instructive, and formative. The psyche, once fragmented or reactive, is gradually oriented toward wholeness, coherence, and purpose. In essence, suffering is a sacred pedagogy. It is a medium through which the self confronts shadow, integrates unconscious content, develops resilience, cultivates moral and relational intelligence, and awakens spiritually. To accept suffering as a teacher is to recognize that every challenge, every loss, every discomfort carries within it the potential for transformation. It is to step willingly into life's crucible, knowing that wisdom, strength, and self-realization emerge not in the absence of adversity, but precisely through engagement with it. Each encounter with suffering is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to align more fully with the truth of one's being. Ultimately, to accept suffering as a teacher is to embrace life in its totality, the light and the shadow, joy and despair, triumph and loss. It is the conscious acknowledgement that pain is inseparable from growth, that adversity is inseparable from meaning, and that transformation is inseparable from challenge. Those who learn to listen to suffering, who interpret lessons with courage and clarity, and who integrate its teachings into the architecture of their lives, attain a form of mastery that is both psychological and spiritual. Suffering ceases to be a tyrant and becomes a guide, a mentor, and a gateway to wholeness. It teaches patience, humility, resilience, insight, and above all, the sacred art of living consciously, authentically, and fully. The human psyche is divided, not merely by circumstance or social conditioning, but by the fundamental architecture of consciousness itself. The conscious mind, with its clarity, reason, and awareness, navigates the observable world, makes decisions, and shapes action. The unconscious, vast and enigmatic, is the repository of instincts, archetypes, repressed emotions, unresolved conflicts, and latent potential. To synthesize the conscious and unconscious is to undertake the most profound work a human being can undertake, the reconciliation of all parts of the self into a coherent, integrated whole. This synthesis is not optional, nor is it trivial. It is the essential path to individuation, authentic identity, and psychological wholeness. It is through this process that the human being transforms from a fragmented reactive entity into a conscious participant in the unfolding of life, capable of both insight and creativity, action and reflection, morality and self-mastery. The first step toward synthesis is awareness of division. Most humans live predominantly in the conscious sphere, guided by logic, social expectation, and habit, while the unconscious operates as a shadowed force, influencing behavior, perception, and emotion in subtle and profound ways. The unconscious is not merely a storehouse of past trauma or repressed desire, it is also a wellspring of creativity, intuition, and archetypal insight. Yet because it is unacknowledged, it often manifests in distorted or disruptive forms: projection, compulsive behavior, anxiety, and repetitive life patterns. The conscious mind, untrained in the language of the unconscious, frequently interprets these manifestations as external threats, accidents of fate, or evidence of personal inadequacy. The task of synthesis requires the conscious mind to recognize its own blind spots, to acknowledge the potency of the unconscious, and to engage with it deliberately rather than reactively. Shadow work is central to this synthesis. The shadow represents those aspects of the psyche that are denied, repressed, or unintegrated traits, desires, fears, and impulses that the conscious mind finds unacceptable or uncomfortable. To synthesize consciousness and the unconscious, one must confront the shadow with honesty, courage, and compassion. This is a perilous undertaking, for the shadow often appears as a psychological adversary. It evokes fear, resistance, and moral uncertainty. Yet the shadow is not an enemy to be destroyed, it is a repository of potential and a mirror of the self. By confronting and integrating the shadow, the conscious mind expands its capacity for understanding, empathy, and authentic action. Each shadow trait, once acknowledged and harmonized, becomes a source of insight and creative energy, enriching the totality of the self. Dreams, fantasies, and symbols are essential tools in the synthesis of conscious and unconscious realms. The unconscious communicates primarily through imagery, metaphor, and archetypal representation, rather than through linear logic or verbal articulation. Dreams, therefore, are not mere hallucinations or random neural firing. Yes, they are messages, warnings, and invitations from the unconscious. By attending to these symbols with careful reflection, interpretation, and intuition, the conscious mind can decode the unconscious and incorporate its wisdom. Archetypal motifs, such as the hero, the shadow, the wise old man, the anima or animus, serve as guides, illuminating universal patterns that resonate with the individual psyche. Engaging with these motifs is both a psychological and spiritual exercise, allowing the conscious mind to participate in the timeless narratives of human existence while enriching personal self-understanding. Integration of conscious and unconscious is also an ethical imperative. The unconscious contains not only creative potential but also destructive tendencies, moral blind spots, and latent aggressions. Without conscious acknowledgement, these forces manifest externally, often through projection onto others, blame, or compulsive repetition of harmful behaviors. Synthesis requires that the conscious mind take responsibility for these unconscious elements, transforming reactive patterns into deliberate choices. By bringing the unconscious into dialogue with consciousness, the individual gains mastery over impulses, aligns behavior with ethical principles, and cultivates moral clarity. In this sense, psychological integration is inseparable from ethical development. The more complete the synthesis, the more capable the individual becomes of acting responsibly, empathetically, and courageously in the world. The process of synthesis is gradual and iterative. It demands patience, self-reflection, and sustained attention. Moments of insight are often accompanied by discomfort, confusion, or emotional turbulence, as unconscious content challenges conscious assumptions and habitual patterns. Yet this tension is the very medium through which transformation occurs. The conscious mind must learn to tolerate ambiguity, confront anxiety, and embrace the unknown. Each engagement with the unconscious deepens awareness, strengthens resilience, and expands the capacity for creative problem-solving. Over time, a new equilibrium emerges, one in which conscious decision-making is informed by unconscious insight, and unconscious impulses are tempered by conscious reflection. The psyche, once fragmented, becomes more coherent, adaptive, and capable of self-directed growth. The emotional dimension of synthesizing consciousness and the unconscious is profound. Interpersonal conflicts often arise from unacknowledged unconscious material projected onto others. By recognizing these projections and taking ownership of the inner causes of conflict, we can begin to address the root causes of the problem. The individual cultivates more authentic, empathetic, and constructive relationships. Furthermore, understanding the unconscious dynamics of others without judgment, but with discernment enhances social intelligence and moral perception. The individual learns to navigate complex social environments with both ethical integrity and psychological sophistication, recognizing that the quality of outer relationships mirrors the state of inner integration. Spiritually, the synthesis of conscious and unconscious resonates with the archetypal journey of transformation and self-realization. In Jungian terms, individuation is not merely psychological but also spiritual. It is the process by which the individual aligns with the deeper currents of life, engages with universal patterns, and participates consciously in the unfolding of meaning. By synthesizing consciousness and unconscious, the individual awakens to dimensions of experience beyond egoic concerns, gaining access to intuition, creativity, and transpersonal insight. The self, once fragmented, emerges as a coherent guiding principle, directing the individual toward purpose, wholeness, and ethical alignment. Practical engagement in synthesis requires disciplined reflection, observation, and active experimentation. Practices such as journaling, meditation, dream analysis, active imagination, and creative expression facilitate dialogue between conscious and unconscious realms. The conscious mind must cultivate awareness of recurring patterns, emotional reactions, and symbolic material, testing hypotheses, experimenting with behavior, and reflecting upon outcomes. This iterative process transforms unconscious content from opaque and disruptive into integrated, productive, and morally coherent elements of the psyche. Each insight, each creative impulse, each ethical choice represents a step toward wholeness, a moment of alignment between inner depths and conscious life. The obstacles to synthesis are substantial. Fear, defensiveness, and habitual resistance often impede engagement with the unconscious. The ego, accustomed to control, may reject the unpredictability of unconscious content. Cultural, social, and familial conditioning may impose rigid frameworks that obscure the voice of the psyche. Yet these obstacles are themselves invitations. They reveal precisely where the conscious mind is rigid, unexamined, or fragmented. To synthesize, one must cultivate courage, humility, and patience, qualities that allow the conscious mind to listen, learn, and integrate without denial or distortion. In essence, the synthesis of conscious and unconscious is the path to psychological maturity, authentic creativity, and ethical living. It is the reconciliation of thought and instinct, reason and intuition, morality and desire. It transforms fear into courage, fragmentation into coherence, and chaos into meaningful pattern. The individual who achieves this synthesis does not merely navigate life reactively, they participate actively in the creation of meaning, wielding the full spectrum of the psyche as a source of insight, ethical action, and transformative power. Synthesis is not a final state but an ongoing dynamic, a lifelong engagement with the ever-unfolding depths of consciousness and the inexhaustible richness of the unconscious. Ultimately, to synthesize conscious and unconscious is to embrace the totality of existence within oneself. It is to act with awareness of inner depths, to recognize the interplay of instinct, archetype, and reason, and to integrate all facets of being into coherent action and thought. It is to stand fully in one's own life, neither fragmented nor passive but whole, aware, and empowered. In this synthesis lies the promise of individuation, the cultivation of virtue, and the achievement of authentic pride, a life lived fully, consciously, and in harmony with the profound architecture of the psyche. Through this integration, the human being moves from reaction to mastery, from fragmentation to wholeness, and from unconscious drift to conscious, purposeful engagement with the world. Individuation is the sacred journey of the self, the lifelong pursuit of wholeness, authenticity, and the realization of one's inherent potential. It is the path by which the fragmented human psyche gradually becomes integrated, coherent, and aligned with the deeper currents of existence. In Jungian psychology, individuation is not a mere intellectual or ethical undertaking, it is the primary task of human life, the central process through which the unconscious and conscious aspects of the psyche are reconciled, and the self emerges as a guiding, organizing principle. To pursue individuation is to undertake the most profound and challenging journey a human being can embark upon. To confront the shadow, integrate unconscious material, cultivate self-knowledge, and live in alignment with one's true nature. The journey of individuation begins with awareness, a recognition that the self is not identical with the persona, the social mask, or the ego's constructed identity. Most individuals live primarily through their persona, the adaptation of the self to societal expectation, familial obligation, and external validation. This adaptation, while necessary for social functioning, is inherently incomplete. It obscures the deeper dimensions of the psyche, suppresses authentic impulses, and denies latent potential. To pursue individuation is to move beyond this superficial identity, to peel away layers of conditioning, and to confront the truths of the inner world with courage, honesty, and patience. It requires the realization that true selfhood is not granted by society, approval, or circumstance, but discovered and enacted through conscious effort and self-reflection. Central to individuation is the confrontation with the shadow, the collection of traits, desires, fears, and impulses that the conscious mind has disowned or repressed. The shadow is not merely the repository of moral failings, it is also the source of creativity, vitality, and unacknowledged potential. Shadow work is therefore both terrifying and liberating. It requires the individual to face impulses that have been denied, to examine fears that have been suppressed, and to acknowledge moral blind spots that have gone unrecognized. Yet the integration of the shadow is essential. Without it, the psyche remains fragmented, and the ego remains vulnerable to projection, compulsive behavior, and inner conflict. The pursuit of individuation demands the courage to meet one's own darkness, to transform it through conscious acknowledgement, and to harmonize it with the conscious mind, creating a richer, more authentic, and more resilient self. Individuation also involves the synthesis of conscious and unconscious elements. The unconscious, with its archetypal images, instincts, and latent capacities, is a vast reservoir of guidance, insight, and creative energy. Yet it is inaccessible to the ego without deliberate engagement. Dreams, fantasies, and symbolic experiences provide a bridge between these realms, offering messages, warnings, and opportunities for growth. The individual pursuing individuation must learn to listen to these communications, to reflect upon their meaning, and to integrate their wisdom into conscious life. In doing so, the psyche becomes more coherent. Instinct is tempered by reason, emotion is guided by insight, and creativity is aligned with purpose. This synthesis is not a final achievement but a dynamic, ongoing process, a continuous dialogue between conscious awareness and unconscious depth. The ethical dimension of individuation is inseparable from its psychological aspect. To pursue wholeness is to cultivate responsibility for one's actions, for one's relationships, and for the impact of one's presence in the world. The individuated self is not self-centered in a narrow sense. It is self-aware, autonomous, and capable of engaging with the broader moral and social landscape with clarity and integrity. Ethical discernment emerges naturally as the individual integrates unconscious drives, understands shadow impulses, and develops the capacity to act consciously rather than reactively. Moral growth and psychological integration are therefore intertwined. The process of becoming whole is simultaneously the process of becoming responsible, empathetic, and aligned with universal principles. Individuation is also the pathway to authentic creativity and personal fulfillment. When the self is integrated, the individual is liberated from the compulsions of ego, the need for external validation, and the repetitive patterns of fear and avoidance. Creativity flows from the unconscious as inspiration, and action is guided by insight rather than reaction. The individuated person is capable of original thought, artistic expression, and moral innovation because they act from the depths of their being rather than from superficial conditioning. Life itself becomes a canvas for conscious expression. Every choice, every relationship, every pursuit is informed by awareness, coherence, and alignment with the self. The pursuit of individuation requires patience, humility, and courage. It is neither linear nor comfortable. Moments of insight are often accompanied by disorientation, emotional turbulence, and the disruption of previously held certainties. Relationships may be challenged, social norms may be questioned, and personal habits may require transformation. Yet these difficulties are the crucibles in which individuation occurs. Resistance is natural, the ego fears dissolution, the persona resists change, and the unconscious tests readiness through dreams, coincidences, and encounters. To pursue individuation is to persist through these trials, to embrace discomfort as a teacher, and to recognize that the path of wholeness is forged in the tension between challenge and insight. Spiritual awareness is deeply intertwined with individuation. Jung emphasized that individuation is not purely psychological, it is a spiritual journey as well, connecting the individual to archetypal realities, universal truths, and transcendent meaning. Symbols, rituals, and reflective practices cultivate this awareness, enabling the individual to engage with life as a conscious participant rather than a passive reactor. In this way, Individuation is a bridge between the finite and the infinite, between personal experience and universal principle. Yes, it allows the self to enact wisdom, insight, and creativity in alignment with the deeper currents of existence. Practically, the pursuit of individuation requires active engagement with life. Self-reflection, journaling, dream analysis, and meditation provide tools for understanding unconscious material and integrating it consciously. Ethical exercises, compassionate action, and deliberate choice cultivate responsibility and coherence. Engagement with art, literature, and philosophy facilitates the encounter with archetypal patterns and universal truths. Daily practices of courage, honesty, and mindfulness train the ego to act in harmony with the self, rather than in reaction to fear or social expectation. Each action, reflection, and insight accumulates, creating a life aligned with authenticity, wholeness, and purpose. The pursuit of individuation is a lifelong endeavor. It is not a destination but a continuous unfolding, a dynamic process that evolves as the individual encounters new challenges, gains new insight, and deepens self-awareness. The individuated self is never static, it is continually tested, refined, and expanded through the interplay of conscious reflection, unconscious revelation, and ethical action. It is a journey of courage, discernment, creativity, and self-realization, a path in which the human being gradually awakens to the full spectrum of potential within. Ultimately, to pursue individuation is to embrace life fully, consciously, and authentically. It is to confront fear, integrate shadow, synthesize conscious and unconscious elements, and cultivate ethical, creative, and spiritual wholeness. It is the path toward becoming the person one was always meant to be, a life lived with insight, integrity, and profound self-respect. Individuation is the fulfillment of human potential, the reconciliation of inner divisions, and the conscious participation in the unfolding of meaning. It is the journey of becoming whole, of honoring the self, and of living in alignment with the deepest truths of existence. Human life, in its most profound and transformative dimension, is not measured by appearances, accolades, or the fleeting admiration of others. It is measured by the depth of experience, the authenticity of engagement, and the conscious integration of inner life with outer action. To value depth over superficiality is to recognize that its true worth, wisdom, and fulfillment reside not in what is visible, performative, or transient, but in the underlying currents of meaning, understanding, and self-awareness that guide behavior, perception, and relationship. Superficiality is seductive because it offers immediate gratification, social approval, and a sense of belonging. Yet it is ultimately illusory, a veneer that conceals the fragmented nature of the unexamined psyche. Depth, by contrast, requires courage, patience, and reflection. It is a deliberate cultivation of consciousness, an engagement with both the conscious and unconscious dimensions of the self, and a refusal to be swayed by the ephemeral or the shallow. The first step in valuing depth is an acknowledgement of the superficial tendencies inherent in human nature and culture. Society often rewards appearance over substance, performance over presence, and popularity over authenticity. The ego, eager for validation and fearful of discomfort, gravitates toward these superficial measures of worth. Social media, consumerism, and performative culture amplify this tendency, creating a constant environment of comparison, distraction, and mimicry. Most individuals, unconsciously complicit in this dynamic, measure their lives by standards imposed externally rather than cultivated internally. Yet the psyche, particularly the unconscious, resists such shallowness. It signals through dissatisfaction, boredom, anxiety, and existential unease that life is being lived at the surface rather than in its profound potential. To value depth is to heed this signal, to shift focus from external validation to internal integrity, and to cultivate the qualities that nurture true understanding and meaning. Depth is cultivated in the conscious engagement with the self. This requires introspection, reflection, and the willingness to confront one's own complexities, contradictions, and shadows. Superficiality manifests in avoidance, ignoring uncomfortable truths, projecting blame onto others, or indulging in distraction to evade self-examination. Depth, in contrast, demands that one meet oneself honestly, exploring hidden motives, suppressed desires, and unresolved conflicts. By acknowledging and integrating these dimensions of the psyche, the individual develops coherence, authenticity, and resilience. Depth is not an abstract quality, it is an active process, realized through consistent engagement with the self and the world. The cultivation of depth also involves valuing the richness of experience over mere accumulation of stimuli. Life offers innumerable sensory, intellectual, and emotional experiences, yet superficial engagement, skimming, distraction, or passivity leaves the psyche undernourished. Depth requires sustained attention, presence, and curiosity. Reading not to impress, but to understand; listening not to respond, but to comprehend; observing not to judge, but to discern. Each moment of genuine attention builds the architecture of insight, enriching perception and understanding. Superficiality, by contrast, fragments experience, leaving the individual grasping at appearances without ever encountering essence. Depth transforms experience into wisdom. Superficiality transforms wisdom into mimicry. Relationships provide another arena in which depth must be valued. Superficial relationships are transactional, performative, and limited to surface-level interactions, admiration, convenience, or social alignment. They often lack trust, vulnerability, and mutual insight. Depth in relationships requires empathy, patience, and care. Edge. The willingness to engage with another person's shadow, to navigate conflict with integrity, and to share one's own inner life without pretense. Such relationships are not always comfortable, but they are transformative. They allow for genuine intimacy, mutual growth, and the co-creation of meaning. In contrast, superficial interactions reinforce egoic dependence, reinforce patterns of avoidance, and maintain psychic fragmentation. To value depth is to choose relationships that challenge, teach, and expand consciousness rather than merely gratify desire or social expectation. Creativity and work are further dimensions in which depth manifests. Superficial engagement produces imitation, formulaic output, and ephemeral recognition. Depth, however, manifests as sustained effort, exploration of complexity, and engagement with principles, archetypes, or truths that transcend immediate reward. The artist, thinker, or craftsman who values depth is willing to wrestle with complexity, to endure uncertainty, and to confront personal and collective shadows in pursuit of genuine expression. This commitment to depth transforms labor into vocation, work into ritual, and creation into ASI. Superficiality, by contrast, reduces expression to performance, repetition, or mimicry, leaving both creator and audience impoverished. The philosophical dimension of valuing depth is inseparable from self-knowledge and existential awareness. Superficiality assumes that life can be understood and mastered through appearances, roles, or transient pleasures. Depth recognizes the paradox, ambiguity, and complexity of existence, engaging with it not to dominate, but to understand. It embraces the tension between the finite and infinite, the conscious and unconscious, life and death. Depth fosters humility, insight, and the capacity to navigate uncertainty without succumbing to fear, escapism, or moral compromise. It transforms life into a conscious exploration rather than a passive drift, aligning action with understanding and intention rather than imitation or egoic desire. The unconscious plays a central role in cultivating depth. Superficial living often ignores the unconscious, relegating it to a source of distraction, irrationality, or discomfort. Yet the unconscious contains the most profound wisdom. Archetypal patterns, latent creativity, ethical insight, and spiritual guidance. Engaging with the unconscious through dreams, symbols, active imagination, and reflection cultivates depth by expanding the conscious mind's understanding of hidden motivations, untapped potential, and universal truths. The individuated person learns to integrate these insights into conscious life, transforming instinct, intuition, and imagination into tools of discernment, creativity, and authentic action. The ethical dimension of depth emphasizes responsibility over performance. Superficiality often prioritizes approval, advantage, or avoidance over integrity, insight, and moral courage. Depth requires that the individual align choices, behavior, and relationships with inner truth, even when inconvenient, uncomfortable, or socially counterintuitive. It cultivates autonomy, self-respect, and the ability to act from principle rather than compulsion. Through this alignment, the individual experiences meaning, coherence, and fulfillment that superficiality cannot provide. Spiritually, valuing depth over superficiality is a gateway to transcendent awareness. The superficial life is preoccupied with transient objects, appearances, and egoic narratives. It remains confined to the surface of experience. Depth, in contrast, opens the individual to archetypal truths, symbolic insight, and the living currents of the psyche. It fosters connection to the collective unconscious, moral insight, and the larger rhythms of existence. In this way, depth is not merely psychological or ethical, it is sacred, facilitating the alignment of human life with universal patterns of meaning and purpose. Practical cultivation of depth requires conscious intention, discipline, and reflection. The individual must develop habits of observation, journaling, meditation, and deliberate engagement with both self and world. They must resist distractions, evaluate motivations honestly, and challenge superficial judgments or responses. They must cultivate relationships, experiences, and creative endeavors that demand insight, presence, and sustained attention. Over time, these practices accumulate, transforming superficial habits into the architecture of conscious, reflective, and meaningful life. To value depth is to choose substance over appearance, insight over convenience, and integrity over pretense. It is a commitment to self-knowledge, psychological integration, relationship, authenticity, creative rigor, and spiritual awareness. It is the refusal to allow life to be dominated by superficial impressions, fleeting validation, or the illusions of the ego. It is the conscious cultivation of a life in which meaning, authenticity, and wholeness are prioritized above all else. Ultimately, to value depth over superficiality is to embrace life fully, with awareness of shadow and light, with courage in the face of ambiguity, and with commitment to integrity, creativity, and truth. It is to live consciously, authentically, and responsibly, navigating the currents of existence with insight and purpose. Superficiality may offer ease, approval, and momentary satisfaction, but only depth offers transformation, fulfillment, and alignment with the totality of the self. By choosing depth, the individual not only honors the complexity of the psyche, but also cultivates a life of wisdom, integrity, and enduring meaning, a life worthy of pride, reflection, and genuine accomplishment. Failure is not merely an event, it is a mirror, a teacher, and a threshold through which the psyche speaks. In the human experience, failure is inevitable, unavoidable, and often misunderstood. The ego, conditioned to equate success with worth, perceives failure as humiliation, inadequacy, or defeat. Yet from the Jungian perspective, failure is neither punishment nor a sign of intrinsic deficiency. It is an essential instrument in the architecture of psychological and spiritual growth. To transform failure into wisdom is to recognize it as a necessary crucible, one that confronts the individual with the limitations of the ego, the hidden dimensions of the psyche, and the unexamined patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. The first insight in this transformative process is to view failure not as catastrophe but as revelation. Every failure carries encoded information about the self, about unconscious fears, unacknowledged desires, moral blind spots, and latent potential. When an endeavor collapses, when plans falter, or when expectations are unmet, the psyche signals that something within has been ignored, suppressed, or misaligned. The conscious mind often recoils from this signal, blaming circumstances, others, or fortune. The individuated mind, however, approaches failure as a diagnostic instrument. It asks, what does this reveal about my choices, about my limitations, about the projections I have imposed on others, about the values I claim versus those I enact? By posing these questions, the individual transforms failure from a painful event into a medium of profound insight. Failure also functions as a portal to humility. The human ego thrives on certainty, competence, and the illusion of control. Failure, by definition, shatters these illusions. It exposes the fragility of assumptions, the incompleteness of knowledge, and the vulnerability inherent in existence. Humility, however, is not merely a social or moral virtue, it is a psychological necessity. It prepares the psyche to receive lessons that arrogance or complacency would obscure. Through failure, the individual learns the limitations of egoic knowledge, the necessity of reflection, and the value of openness to unconscious wisdom. Humility transforms failure from shame into a teacher, cultivating receptivity to guidance, insight, and growth. Central to transforming failure into wisdom is the confrontation with the shadow. The shadow, comprising all that is disowned, denied, or repressed in the psyche, often underlies repeated failures. Compulsive patterns, unacknowledged fears, immoral avoidance, or projection onto others frequently precipitate failure. By examining the circumstances and inner dynamics that led to failure, the individual encounters shadow material that has been driving unconscious behavior. This confrontation is neither comfortable nor facile. It may reveal selfishness, fear, inadequacy, or moral compromise, yet it is precisely this encounter that enables growth. Failure acts as a spotlight, illuminating the shadow that must be integrated to move toward wholeness. The lessons of failure are inseparable from the work of shadow integration. To transform failure into wisdom is to reconcile conscious intention with unconscious reality. Resilience is another gift embedded in failure. To face failure without capitulation requires courage, fortitude, and persistence. Those who shy from failure remain trapped in cycles of avoidance, seeking comfort and validation over insight and growth. Those who engage with failure develop resilience, the capacity to endure discomfort, to reflect upon lessons, and to act anew with greater awareness. Resilience is not mere endurance, it is an adaptive, intelligent engagement with life's challenges, allowing the individual to navigate uncertainty with composure, insight, and ethical discernment. Failure, therefore, is the crucible in which resilience is forged, the arena in which courage is tested, and the laboratory in which wisdom is distilled. Failure also fosters creativity and innovation. The collapse of prior plans, assumptions, or expectations creates a vacuum in which the psyche can explore alternative possibilities. Rigid adherence to habitual strategies often obscures novel insight. When failure disrupts routine, it stimulates reflection, imagination, and experimentation. The mind is forced to transcend previous limitations, confront unconscious resistance, and engage with new patterns of thought or action. In this sense, failure is not merely corrective but generative. It catalyzes the emergence of solutions, strategies, and perspectives that could not have arisen in the comfort of unbroken success. Wisdom emerges in this interplay between disruption, reflection, and creative adaptation. The ethical dimension of failure is equally profound. Failures often expose moral misalignment, the consequences of shortcuts, avoidance, or neglect of responsibility. By attending consciously to these consequences, the individual develops moral discernment, integrity, and accountability. Transformation occurs not merely through technical correction or strategic adjustment, but through ethical reflection and the deliberate alignment of behavior with principle. Wisdom, in this sense, is inseparable from ethical awareness. The individual learns to act with conscious responsibility, guided by both insight and principle, rather than merely pursuing convenience or external validation. Failure also engages the temporal dimension of growth. Lessons embedded in failure are rarely immediate. They unfold over time through reflection, repeated observation, and iterative learning. The initial experience of failure often evokes emotional turbulence, disappointment, shame, frustration, and grief. Yet these responses are not obstacles, they are essential signals revealing attachments, unacknowledged expectations, and unconscious patterns. By attending patiently to these responses, reflecting on their origins and implications, we can gain a deeper understanding of the issues at hand. And integrating insights gradually into conscious life, the individual cultivates a deep, enduring wisdom. Failure teaches not only in the moment of collapse but of experience, embedding lessons that shape character, judgment, and the architecture of the psyche over a lifetime. The relational dimension of failure is also instructive. Failures often arise in interaction with others, or reveal projections, assumptions, and relational blind spots. They highlight miscommunication, unacknowledged biases, and the consequences of inauthenticity. By reflecting upon the relational aspects of failure, the individual gains insight into the dynamics of influence, projection, empathy, and ethical responsibility. Transforming failure into wisdom thus entails not only personal reflection but relational awareness, understanding how one's actions, attitudes, and unconscious patterns affect others, and how feedback and consequence inform the maturation of character. Spiritually, failure is a threshold to deeper self-realization. In confronting limitation, loss, and imperfection, the individual is reminded of the finite, transient, and contingent nature of life. Superficial responses, blame, avoidance, or despair reinforce egoic illusions of omnipotence. Engagement with failure, however, cultivates acceptance, perspective, and humility, connecting the individual with deeper archetypal patterns of growth, endurance, and transformation. In this sense, failure is a sacrament. It teaches the limitations of the self, opens access to unconscious wisdom, and fosters alignment with the universal currents of meaning that transcend egoic desire. Practically, transforming failure into wisdom involves disciplined reflection and integration. One must resist the impulse to externalize blame, deny responsibility, or suppress emotional response. One must analyze the circumstances of failure, identify patterns, confront shadow elements, and extract lessons that inform future action. Journaling, meditation, dialogue, and creative expression are tools through which insights can be articulated and integrated. Ethical reflection ensures that lessons are translated into responsible action, while relational awareness ensures that insight informs interaction with others. Iterative practice consolidates wisdom, transforming isolated failures into cumulative understanding and enduring growth. Ultimately, to transform failure into wisdom is to embrace the totality of experience, light and shadow, success and collapse, expectation and reality. As to recognize that the human journey is not linear, predictable, or comfortable, and that true mastery arises not from the avoidance of failure but from engagement with it. Those who learn from failure do not merely survive misfortune, they cultivate insight, moral clarity, resilience, creativity, and self-knowledge. Each failure becomes a step in the architecture of wholeness, a teacher guiding toward authentic individuation, ethical alignment, and conscious participation in life. In essence, failure is not an endpoint but a threshold, not a judgment but a lesson, not a defeat but a source of insight. By confronting failure, reflecting upon its causes, integrating its lessons, and acting with renewed awareness, the individual transforms adversity into wisdom, weakness into strength, and imperfection into authentic self-realization. To pursue this path is to honor the psyche, cultivate moral and ethical integrity, and participate consciously in the unfolding of one's own life. Failure, once mastered as teacher, becomes the most profound instrument of growth, a crucible in which the human spirit is tempered, refined, and awakened. Human beings have long been conditioned to seek validation externally. From childhood we learn to measure our worth by the gaze of others, parental approval, social recognition, professional accolades, and the fleeting admiration of peers. Yet this reliance on external validation, though natural, is profoundly limiting. It fragments the psyche, distorts perception, and fosters insecurity. When the measure of worth is external, the individual becomes a vessel for others' expectations, a performer in the theater of social approval, and a prisoner of collective judgment. To measure by inner approval is to reclaim autonomy over the self, to ground identity in authentic principles, and to cultivate a life guided by conscious discernment rather than reactive dependence. It is an essential step on the path of individuation, the journey toward wholeness and the realization of the self. The first insight in this process is the recognition of the pervasive influence of the external gaze. Societal norms, cultural narratives, and relational expectations shape perception in subtle and overt ways. The ego, eager for acceptance, often conforms, suppressing impulses, desires, and convictions that might elicit disapproval. This suppression, adaptive in social terms, distances the individual from the deeper currents of the psyche, instincts, archetypes, and the authentic voice of the self. When self-worth is contingent upon others, behavior becomes performative, decisions are calculated for social reward rather than guided by inner wisdom, and life is navigated through fear rather than conscious engagement. Inner approval, by contrast, establishes a stable, intrinsic reference point. It allows the individual to act with integrity, pursue authentic goals, and achieve success through hard work and dedication, and cultivate a life aligned with conscious understanding rather than ephemeral external metrics. Inner approval arises from the disciplined cultivation of self-knowledge. The conscious mind must become aware of its own values, principles, and authentic desires, and distinguish them from conditioned responses, social mimicry, or habitual patterns. This requires sustained reflection, introspection, and honest dialogue with the unconscious. Dreams, symbolic imagery, and active imagination reveal the latent truths of the psyche, providing guidance toward what is genuinely meaningful and authentic. Inner approval is earned not through egoic assertion or social manipulation, but through conscious engagement with these deeper dimensions. By understanding oneself's strengths, limitations, moral convictions, and potential, the individual establishes a reliable internal measure of worth, one that is resilient to the fluctuations of social opinion. The shadow plays a crucial role in this process. External validation often masks unacknowledged aspects of the self, allowing avoidance, projection, and denial to persist. By contrast, inner approval requires confrontation with shadow elements, fears, repressed desires, moral blind spots, and unacknowledged motivations. This confrontation is neither comfortable nor simple. The shadow is a mirror of what we deny or disown. Yet integration of the shadow strengthens the inner compass. By recognizing, accepting, and reconciling these aspects, the individual cultivates authenticity, self-coherence, and moral clarity. Inner approval is therefore inseparable from shadow work. The more complete the integration, the more stable, reliable, and discerning the inner reference point becomes. Ethical alignment is another cornerstone of inner approval. When worth is measured externally, morality often becomes performative. Actions are shaped to gain admiration, avoid censure, or manipulate perception. True inner approval, by contrast, arises from consistent alignment with ethical principles, moral insight, and conscious responsibility. The individual learns to act not for applause or avoidance of criticism, but for the integrity of the choice itself. Each decision, reflection, and action becomes an opportunity to validate oneself from within, reinforcing coherence between conscious intent, moral conviction, and behavior. In this alignment lies resilience, the ability to remain steadfast, discerning, and ethically grounded even when social opinion is adverse, indifferent, or hostile. The relational dimension of inner approval is profound. Social pressures, relational dynamics, and cultural expectations often shape self-perception in subtle ways. By anchoring worth internally, the individual cultivates relationships that are authentic rather than transactional, chosen rather than compelled. Others are engaged not as sources of validation but as mirrors, companions, and collaborators in mutual growth. Conflicts, criticism, and disagreement are interpreted through the lens of inner discernment rather than reactive fear, allowing for constructive engagement, self-reflection, and moral clarity. Inner approval fosters relational maturity, empathy, and the capacity for authentic intimacy. One interacts with others from wholeness rather than fragmentation, from understanding rather than dependence. Creativity and self-expression are profoundly enhanced when measured by inner approval. The artist, thinker, or innovator who relies upon external praise is constrained, imitating prevailing norms, limiting exploration, and deferring insight to collective opinion. Inner approval liberates the individual to explore uncharted ideas, confront complexity, and express authentic vision. It aligns action with internal guidance rather than ephemeral applause, fostering originality, courage, and sustained engagement with meaning. Each act of creation becomes a declaration of self-knowledge, a testament to internal coherence, and a step toward individuation. Failure, too, acquires a different meaning through inner approval. When self-worth is externally measured, failure is devastating, often provoking shame, avoidance, or despair. Inner approval, by contrast, reframes failure as feedback, insight, and an opportunity for growth. The individual measures action against personal standards of integrity, courage, and insight, rather than popularity, reward, or judgment. Mistakes become instructive, challenges become invitations, and the self remains grounded despite external turbulence. Wisdom, resilience, and creativity are thus nurtured in the fertile soil of inner validation. Spiritual dimensions of inner approval are profound. Outer validation, by its nature, is contingent, transient, and limited to the observable realm. Inner approval, however, aligns the individual with archetypal truths, unconscious wisdom, and the deeper currents of existence. It fosters a sense of wholeness, integration, and participation in the unfolding of life. By cultivating an internal measure of worth, the individual accesses a sense of purpose, meaning, and ethical alignment that transcends societal fluctuations, ephemeral acclaim, and superficial metrics. Inner approval is thus both psychological and spiritual. It situates the self within a coherent moral and existential framework, harmonizing conscious awareness, unconscious insight, and lived experience. Practical cultivation of inner approval requires deliberate, sustained effort. The individual must develop awareness of internal values, ethical principles, and authentic desires. Shadow elements must be confronted, reflected upon, and integrated. Reflection, journaling, meditation, and symbolic exploration serve as tools to clarify internal guidance. Relationships, creative work, and life choices must be evaluated according to internal coherence rather than external reward. Feedback, criticism, and social pressure are received with discernment rather than automatic submission. Over time, inner approval becomes habitual, stabilizing identity, decision-making, and perception against the fluctuating currents of external judgment. Ultimately, to measure by inner approval is to reclaim sovereignty over the self. It is to resist the tyranny of external validation, to cultivate coherence between conscious intent, unconscious insight, and ethical action, and to ground worth in intrinsic understanding rather than performative reception. The individual who measures life by inner standards navigates existence with authenticity, integrity, and resilience, finding fulfillment in alignment rather than applause. Superficiality, comparison, and dependence on others' judgment lose their grip, replaced by clarity, self-knowledge, and deliberate, conscious participation in life. To measure by inner approval is, therefore, a profound act of individuation, a courageous, disciplined, and ethically aligned commitment to the self. It fosters maturity, insight, creativity, and relational authenticity, empowering the individual to act from wholeness rather than fragmentation. Life becomes a conscious, coherent engagement with the self, others, and the world, a life defined not by applause or approval, but by integrity, wisdom, and the enduring voice of the self. In this internal measure, the individual finds the freedom, clarity, and stability to live fully, act courageously, and cultivate a life worthy of pride, reflection, and enduring meaning. Human beings have an innate tendency to seek validation from the external world. From early childhood, the psyche is conditioned to measure worth by the gaze of parents, the expectations of society, and the fleeting recognition of peers. Praise, acceptance, and acknowledgement become benchmarks for self-esteem, subtly shaping behavior and perception. Yet this external locus of validation is fundamentally unstable. It places the measure of one's life in the hands of others, leaving the psyche vulnerable to fluctuating opinions, social comparison, and ephemeral applause. To measure by inner approval is to reclaim sovereignty over the self, to establish a resilient and coherent standard of value rooted in consciousness, ethical discernment, and authentic engagement with one's own being. It is the path of individuation, the journey toward wholeness, and the cultivation of a psyche that is internally grounded, self-aware, and aligned with the deeper truths of existence. The journey toward inner approval begins with a conscious recognition of the pervasive influence of external validation. Most individuals navigate life through a network of societal expectations, to perform according to roles, to achieve according to prescribed benchmarks, to conform to norms of success, beauty, or propriety. The ego, eager for acceptance, often acquiesces, suppressing genuine desires, instincts, and moral insight. This acquiescence produces a fragmented psyche, conscious identity shaped by social approval, unconscious impulses denied or disowned, shadow elements projected on to others or hidden. In such a state, life is lived in reaction rather than reflection, in imitation rather than authentic expression. To measure by inner approval requires first noticing these patterns. to see where one's choices are motivated by fear of judgment rather than by conscious discernment, and to recognize the subtle ways in which external opinion has colonized personal autonomy. Inner approval is cultivated through rigorous self-knowledge. The conscious mind must become intimately acquainted with its own values, principles, and authentic desires, discerning them from the habits, assumptions, and expectations imposed by external influence. This self-knowledge is not a superficial inventory of likes, dislikes, or ambitions. It is a profound exploration of moral, psychological, and existential truth. One must ask, what is genuinely meaningful to me? Which impulses are authentic, and which are borrowed or reactive? Which decisions honor my inner integrity rather than my need for approval? Through reflection, journaling, meditation, and engagement with symbolic material from dreams and imagination, the individual develops a stable internal reference point, a measure of worry, is independent of external fluctuation. The shadow is central to this process. External validation often masks unacknowledged aspects of the self, traits we deny, impulses we suppress, fears we avoid, and moral blind spots we refuse to see. All reside in the shadow. To cultivate inner approval is to confront these dimensions honestly. Failure to acknowledge shadow elements leaves the psyche fragmented, causing unconscious behavior, projection, and emotional turbulence. Confronting the shadow requires courage. It means observing personal fears, resentments, desires, and impulses without defensiveness, judgment, or denial. Through integration, the shadow becomes a source of insight, creativity, and authenticity. Inner approval is inseparable from this work. Only when the individual recognizes and reconciles unconscious content can they establish a measure of worth that is genuinely self-determined. Ethical alignment is another critical dimension. When one measures life by external approval, morality often becomes performative. Actions are taken to gain admiration, avoid criticism, or maintain status. Inner approval requires that choices be guided by principle rather than by expectation. One acts with integrity, even in the absence of recognition, knowing that ethical coherence is the truest measure of value. This alignment cultivates resilience. External judgment may vary, but internal standards remain stable. The psyche anchored in ethical self-approval navigates social turbulence with clarity, remaining steadfast in the face of disapproval, misunderstanding, or adversity. Relationships provide a profound arena for practicing inner approval. In social life, dependence on validation manifests as people-pleasing, compromise of authentic expression, and over-reliance on approval from friends, family, or colleagues. By cultivating inner standards, the individual engages with others from a place of wholeness rather than fragmentation. Relationships become spaces for mutual growth, authentic exchange, and constructive reflection rather than arenas of insecurity and mimicry. Disagreement or critique is interpreted through the lens of internal discernment rather than egoic fear, allowing insight, empathy, and ethical engagement to flourish. Creativity and self-expression are deeply enhanced when guided by inner approval. The creator who seeks external applause is constrained, imitating prevailing norms, suppressing unique vision, or avoiding risk. By contrast, inner approval fosters freedom. The individual explores novel ideas, engages with complexity, and expresses authentic vision without fear of judgment. Creative work becomes an extension of self-knowledge, a conscious manifestation of integrated insight, and a dialogue between conscious intention and unconscious inspiration. In this process, art, thought, and innovation are nourished by authenticity rather than constrained by superficial validation. Failure also assumes a transformative role in inner approval. When worth is externally measured, failure is devastating, often provoking shame, avoidance, and insecurity. Inner approval reframes failure as feedback, insight, and an opportunity for growth. Decisions are assessed not by popularity or reward but by integrity, courage, and alignment with inner principles. Errors become instructive rather than destructive, cultivating resilience, adaptability, and discernment. Each failure strengthens internal metrics, reinforcing autonomy and ethical grounding. The unconscious plays an essential role in guiding inner approval. External metrics are limited to the visible and socially constructed. The unconscious contains archetypal patterns, latent creativity, and ethical insight that transcend superficial standards. Dreams, symbols, and spontaneous insight provide guidance that is unavailable through observation or imitation alone. By attending to these signals and integrating them consciously, the individual establishes a measure of worth that is dynamic, coherent, and profoundly aligned with the totality of the psyche. Inner approval is thus not merely a psychological construct, it is a dialogue between conscious awareness, unconscious wisdom, and moral discernment. Spiritually, inner approval situates the individual within a larger order of meaning. External validation is contingent, fleeting, and often superficial. Inner approval anchors the psyche in principles, insight, and authentic engagement, fostering a sense of purpose, integration, and wholeness. By cultivating inner standards, the individual aligns with universal patterns, archetypal truths, and the deeper currents of existence, participating consciously in life rather than reacting unconsciously to circumstance or opinion. It is both a psychological and spiritual foundation, the locus of stability, coherence, and authentic selfhood. Practical cultivation of inner approval requires discipline and deliberate effort. The individual must identify authentic values, confront shadow material, and assess behaviors against internal standards rather than external metrics. Reflection, journaling, and symbolic analysis are tools to clarify insight. Ethical alignment ensures that lessons and decisions are embodied in behavior. Relationships, creativity, and life choices are examined through internal coherence. Feedback is processed with discernment, separating insight from social pressure. Over time, these practices consolidate, creating a psyche anchored in self-determined worth, independent of external fluctuation. Ultimately, to measure by inner approval is to reclaim life from the tyranny of others' opinions. It is to cultivate coherence, authenticity, and ethical alignment, transforming the psyche from a reactive instrument into a conscious agent of self-determination. Superficial measures, societal validation, and transient recognition lose their hold, replaced by a stable, resilient standard rooted in insight, principle, and moral awareness. Life becomes a deliberate, coherent engagement with self, others, and existence alike, not by applause but by the enduring voice of the self. Inner approval is the compass by which authentic living is navigated, the foundation of psychological wholeness, and the measure of meaningful, courageous, and integrated action. To measure by inner approval is, in its deepest psychological sense, to relocate the center of gravity of the personality from the external world into the interior structure of the psyche. Most individuals, without realizing it, live in a state of outward contagion in which their thoughts, actions, and even emotions are subtly calibrated to evoke recognition, acceptance, or validation from others. This outward dependence is not merely a behavioral habit, it is a psychological condition rooted in early development, social conditioning, and the formation of the ego. The child learns quickly that approval brings safety and belonging, while disapproval threatens exclusion. Over time, this adaptive mechanism crystallizes into a dominant pattern. The essation, a torch. Self becomes defined by reflection rather than by essence, by how it is seen rather than by what it is. Yet this outward orientation creates a fundamental instability within the psyche. External approval is inherently variable, shaped by shifting cultural norms, personal biases, and the unpredictable perceptions of others. When the self depends upon such unstable ground, it becomes fragmented, anxious, and reactive. One is praised today and doubts oneself tomorrow. One is admired in one context and rejected in another. The psyche, tethered to this volatility, oscillates between inflation and deflation, pride and insecurity, confidence and despair. In such a condition, there can be no enduring sense of identity, only a fluctuating image maintained through constant adjustment. To move toward inner approval is to begin a process of psychological recentering. It requires that the individual withdraw projections from the external world and redirect attention inward, toward the structure, contents, and dynamics of the psyche itself. This is not an act of withdrawal from reality, but rather a deeper engagement with it, for reality is not merely external, it is also internal, composed of thoughts, emotions, archetypes, and unconscious patterns that shape perception and behavior. To measure by inner approval is to recognize that the ultimate authority on one's life must arise from within this inner reality, not from the shifting mirrors of social reflection. At the core of this transformation lies the development of self-awareness. The individual must begin to observe their own motivations with honesty and precision. Why do I seek this outcome? Is it because it aligns with my values, or because it will earn admiration? Why do I fear this action? Is it because it is wrong, or because it might invite disapproval? Such questions penetrate the surface of behavior and reveal the underlying psychological mechanisms. They expose the ways in which the ego has been conditioned to prioritize appearance over authenticity, conformity over truth. This process of self-examination inevitably leads to an encounter with the shadow. The shadow contains all aspects of the self that have been repressed, denied, or disowned in the pursuit of approval. Traits deemed unacceptable: anger, vulnerability, ambition, selfishness, creativity, even strength are pushed into the unconscious because they conflict with the persona, the socially acceptable mask. Yet these disowned elements cannot disappear. They continue to influence behavior from beneath the surface, often manifesting in projection, compulsion, or emotional disturbance. To measure by inner approval requires the integration of the shadow. One must be willing to see oneself fully, without the distortions imposed by the need to appear good or acceptable. This means acknowledging not only one's virtues, but also one's flaws, contradictions, and darker impulses. It is a difficult and often painful process for it. It dismantles the idealized self-image that has been constructed for external consumption. But it is also liberating, for only when the self is seen in its totality can it become coherent, stable, and authentic. As the shadow is integrated, the individual begins to develop an internal standard of evaluation. This standard is not arbitrary, it emerges from the alignment of conscious values, unconscious insights, and lived experience. It is shaped by reflection, ethical consideration, and the gradual accumulation of self-knowledge. Unlike external approval, which is imposed from without, inner approval is cultivated from within. It is earned through integrity, through the consistent alignment of thought, action, and value. Integrity, in this context, becomes the cornerstone of psychological stability. To act with integrity is to act in accordance with one's inner truth, regardless of external reaction. It means choosing what is right over what is rewarded, what is authentic over what is applauded. Each act of integrity reinforces the internal structure of the self, strengthening the connection between the ego and the deeper layers of the psyche. Over time, this creates a sense of solidity and coherence that is not easily shaken by external circumstances. However, the transition from external to internal validation is not without resistance. The psyche is deeply habituated to seeking approval, and the fear of rejection can be powerful. To act according to inner standards often involves risk, the risk of being misunderstood, criticized, or excluded. This fear must be confronted directly. It cannot be bypassed or rationalized away. One must recognize that the cost of external approval is often the loss of authenticity, while the cost of inner approval is the courage to stand alone. This courage is not an abstract virtue, it is developed through repeated action. It is in the small moments, the decision to speak honestly, to set a boundary, to pursue a meaningful path, certainty that inner approval is forged. Each time the individual chooses authenticity over conformity, the internal compass is strengthened. Each time one resists the pull of external validation, the psyche becomes more autonomous, more centered, more whole. Emotionally, this shift produces a profound transformation. The individual becomes less reactive to praise and criticism, less dependent on affirmation, less threatened by disapproval. This does not mean becoming indifferent to others, but rather developing a balanced relationship with external feedback. Praise is appreciated but not necessary. Criticism is considered but not definitive. The individual retains the capacity to listen, to learn, and to adapt, but does so from a position of internal stability rather than external dependence. Cognitively, measuring by inner approval enhances clarity and discernment. Decisions are no longer clouded by the need to please or impress. Instead, they are guided by an internal evaluation of meaning, value, and consequence. This leads to more consistent, coherent, and purposeful action. The individual becomes capable of long-term thinking, resisting short-term rewards that conflict with deeper goals. There is a shift from impulsivity to deliberation, from reaction to intention. Relationally, this transformation alters the nature of interaction. Relationships based on mutual validation or dependency give way to those grounded in authenticity and respect. The individual no longer seeks others to complete or confirm the self, but to engage in genuine exchange. This allows for deeper connection, as both parties are free to express themselves honestly without the distortion of performance. Conflict, when it arises, becomes an opportunity for understanding rather than a threat to self-worth. From a developmental perspective, measuring by inner approval is a hallmark of psychological maturity. It signifies the movement from a dependent, externally oriented identity to an autonomous, internally grounded one. This does not mean rejecting society or disregarding others, but rather integrating external input within an internal framework. The mature individual is capable of participating in the collective while maintaining individuality, of engaging with others without losing oneself. There is also a spiritual dimension to this process. As the individual turns inward and develops a relationship with the deeper layers of the psyche, there is often an encounter with what Jung referred to as the self, the archetype of wholeness and the organizing principle of the psyche. The self represents a totality that transcends the ego, encompassing both conscious and unconscious elements. Inner approval, in its highest form, is not merely personal preference or subjective judgment, it is alignment with this deeper center. To live in accordance with the self is to experience a sense of meaning and direction that is not dependent on external validation. It is to feel guided by an inner necessity, a sense of purpose that arises from within. This does not eliminate uncertainty or difficulty, but it provides a framework within which these challenges can be understood and integrated. Life becomes a process of unfolding, of becoming, rather than a performance to be evaluated. Practically, cultivating inner approval requires consistent effort and attention. It involves developing habits of reflection, such as journaling or meditation, through which one can observe and analyze internal states. It requires the willingness to question assumptions, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to revise one's understanding in light of new insight. It also involves setting boundaries, both internally and externally, to protect the integrity of the self. Over time, these practices lead to a reconfiguration of the psyche. The need for external validation diminishes, replaced by a stable sense of self-worth grounded in authenticity and integrity. The individual becomes less concerned with how they are perceived and more focused on how they live. There is a shift from image to substance, from performance to presence. Ultimately, to measure by inner approval is to live in alignment with one's true nature. It is to recognize that the value of one's life cannot be determined by others, but must be discovered and affirmed from within. It is to accept the responsibility of self-definition, the challenge of authenticity, and the discipline of integrity. In doing so, the individual achieves a form of freedom that is both psychological and existential. The freedom to be oneself, fully and unapologetically, guided not by the fleeting judgments of the world, but by the enduring voice of the inner self. And so, at the end of all striving, all comparison, all restless seeking for recognition, there remains a single quiet question that echoes from the depths of the psyche. Did you live in truth with yourself, not according to the applause of the crowd, nor the expectations imposed upon you, but according to that inner voice which does not shout, yet never lies? To measure by inner approval is not an act of rebellion against the world, it is an act of alignment with the self. It is the realization that no external validation, no matter how grand, can compensate for the silent fracture that occurs when one betrays one's own nature. And equally, no criticism, no rejection, no misunderstanding can diminish the deep, unshakable strength that arises when one stands firmly within their own truth. There will be moments when the world turns away from you because you chose authenticity over conformity. There will be times when your path appears lonely, when doubt whispers, when the old desire for approval resurfaces like a ghost from the past. But in those moments, something far more powerful is being forged within you. A center that does not collapse, a compass that does not waver, a self that is not dependent on reflection but grounded in essence. For the individual who measures life by inner approval walks a different path. It is not the easiest path, nor the most celebrated, but it is the only path that leads to wholeness. It demands courage in small decisions, honesty in hidden moments, and integrity when no one is watching. It asks you to confront yourself, to refine yourself, and ultimately to accept yourself not as an image, but as a living, evolving being. And in this acceptance, something extraordinary happens. The need to prove dissolves, the fear of judgment weakens, the noise of the external world fades into the background. What remains is clarity, clear thought, clear intention, clear action. You begin to act not to impress, but to express, not to be seen, but to be true. This is the quiet power of inner approval. It does not demand attention, yet it transforms everything. It shapes your choices, strengthens your character, and anchors your identity in something that cannot be taken from you. It is the foundation upon which a meaningful life is built, not a life that looks impressive from the outside, but one that feels right from within. In the end, your life will not be measured by how loudly the world applauded you, but by how honestly you lived. Not by how many approved of you, but by whether you approved of yourself when it mattered most, when you stood alone, when you made the difficult choice, when you faced your own reflection without illusion. So walk your path with awareness. Let your decisions arise from understanding, not fear. Let your actions reflect your values, not your need for validation. And when the day comes that you look back upon your life, may you not ask, was I accepted, but rather was I true? For in that truth, in that unwavering alignment between who you are and how you live, you will find something far greater than approval. You will find peace.